Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the beginning of the 16th century where something very important is happening in the firearms history. The first ever pistol that could be carried, cocked and loaded, and capable of immediate fire appears in the hands of the soldiers. But to understand its importance, first we have to understand what kind of firearms were in common by those times, because it was the matchlock, a much harder to manage firearm. Let's check it. The most important problem with the matchlock ignition system was the match itself, which needed a lot of management. You had to be sure that it can reach the priming powder in the pen, you had to be sure that it's long enough, you had to be sure that it's smoldering enough, you have to blow the ashes from the match time by time, and of course it's very sensitive to weather. Well, this was such a great problem that the cavalrymen could not really use the matchlock muskets. There were riders who already used the matchlock system, but they were not really effective because this kind of management on horseback is a very difficult task. So they needed something else. They needed a simpler and much convenient system. Actually, we don't know the true origin of the wheel-lock pistol. There are several sources that say that it's a German invention, and there are several sources that say it is an Italian invention. It is obvious that the steel turning wheel and the pirit that was used for fire making before, and there are fire making devices that actually look like a wheel-lock system. But in fact, we don't really know when it was first built on a pistol. We have some informations. Martin Löffelholz, a citizen in Nuremberg at the beginning of the 16th century, made some beautiful drawings about such locks that could be placed on a firearm as well. Also, Leonardo da Vinci shows some very interesting pictures in his work Codice Atlantico about a wheel-lock system with coil spring that can also be part of a firearm. But one thing for sure, the first written sources are connected to Hungary. You can immediately ask why Hungary. Well, the answer is simple, because we were fighting against the Turks by those times. So Hungary was a very important theater of war in Europe. And the most modern tactics, strategies and the equipment also appeared in this region. So what was the source that told us that, Hungary has some kind of place in the history of the wheel-lock pistol? It is a codex. It is the Hippolyte Codex, which tells us that a castle servant called Kaspar from Eger, it's a city in the northeastern part of Hungary, was sent to Germany to buy some wheel-lock firearms that was later sent to Italy. So there is a possibility that, yes, it was invented in Germany, but later it was sent through Hungary to Italy. But if you ask my opinion, I say that the wheel-lock system was already existing as a fire-making device, which means that it could be a parallel invention. So when the whole story starts, there were pistols with quite straight stocks. Later this was improved to be a bent stock, so which means that the pistol really got a handle. These were the German puffers, usually with short barrels and large caliber. Large caliber meant 16, 18 millimeter, whatever. So the muzzle velocity of these pistols was quite low, and probably the penetration was much less than the later ones, but they punched a really big hole. These were beautiful items, and these were the first items that appeared in military service as well.
The original manuals describe two methods for loading the wheel-lock pistol, with paper cartridges and with loose powder and naked ball. My first trial will be with the following one. My powder charge weighs 1/3 of the weight of the lead ball, being 60 grains of numero 5 1F Swiss black powder. The bullet is a traditional round ball. Its diameter is 0.4 mm or 3.2% smaller than the caliber of the bore. So I load a 12.4 mm ball into the 12.8 mm bore. This tolerance is well within the vintage range of the 17th century pistols and bullets. The bullet left the bore with 307 meters per sec, delivering 561 joules of muzzle energy. Not bad at all. My ISSF 50-meter pistol target is at the normal 25-meter sport shooting distance. The pistol has no sights at all, so I had to use the barrel for aiming. To have a hit in the middle, I had to aim to the bottom edge of the target. I was surprised to see that without any patching, the heavily undersized ball was still kind of accurate.
As the wheel-lock pistol was slowly sneaking into military service, they realized that they have to improve the bore and the caliber to be effective against the heavy armor of the knights, because knights at the 15th and 16th century were still existing on the battlefield. The heavy armor must be pierced, so for piercing such armor you need muzzle velocity, and to reach muzzle velocity you need a lighter bullet and smaller caliber, which is much more effective. So if you check the type of military pistols that they were using at the beginning of the 17th century, you see that they had longer barrels and they had smaller calibers. And this was obvious because also the foot soldiers were wearing armor. So if a pikeman was attacked by a cavalryman, he had to pierce the armor with the pistol as well. The pistol you see in my hands was made in Zul in the middle of the 17th century, and probably this is the most elegant version of the military wheel-lock pistols. Its caliber is 12.7, 12.8 millimeter, and by this time there were several types of these pistols with the same characteristics, and probably this was the most advanced version, which was used until the very beginning of the 18th century as well, when flintlocks took over.
Using a paper cartridge was a common practice already in the end of the 16th century. It was the cavalry first who utilized the unification of the powder and the ball in a paper case. Wrapping the ball in paper resulted a battle seal and a tighter fit. Let's see if it could contribute to the accuracy of my pistol. One thing for sure, it was more convenient to load the pistol this way. 5% increase in muzzle velocity resulted nearly 24% more muzzle energy, nearly reaching 700 joule, close to the energy of the 357 Magnum. On the other hand, although the bullet had a tighter fit, accuracy did not improve too much. There are not too many original sources about how the paper cartridges were rolled in the late 16th and early 17th century. The first method I'm showing is one of the very few we have. The process was described by John Crusoe in his work Military Instructions for the Cavalry, published in 1632. The process starts with rolling the paper on a mandrel or on the ramrod of the pistol, and then folding one end. Please note that the form of the paper is my invention, it is not supported with any historical sources. Now comes the powder charge, that the case will be tied with a string above the charge. One string is tied above the powder. And one string above the lead round ball to hold the projectile in place. I have a strong feeling that Crusoe never rolled any cartridges. He was rather a scholar than a soldier, as the process seems to be written backwards. It is much more convenient to add the powder later and fold the cartridge as the last step. The source for the second type is Anton Dolecek's work about the arms of the Habsburg army. We will need a bullet with the sprue not cut after casting to be able to tie the paper case to the projectile. This will of course add some additional weight, 2-3 grams to the bullet weight. The process starts with rolling the paper on the mandrel together with the bullet. Now it is time to choke the paper on the sprue. Then we add the powder charge and fold the end of the cartridge. This construction is also supported by many museum pieces found in the Army Museum of Vienna. If you are interested in how this type of bullet was cast, please check my previous video about fire making and lead casting the traditional way.
It's a good question what was the effective tactical distance for these pistols, because as you see there are no sights on it, and 90% of these pistols are smoothbore and they don't have sights. Which means that these pistols probably were intended to be used a different way than we use the pistol today. Although I really have to emphasize that the pistol shooting range, the pistol self-defense range is not more than 5 to 10 meters, or maximum 10 meters, that's pretty far, so it's probably under 5 meters today as well. It was the case in the 17th century as well. If we check the original documents, original manuals from this period, they all say that the pistol must be fired from a point-blank range, which really means that sometimes you have to push the muzzle against the body of the enemy. Why is so? Because all the foot soldiers and cavalrymen of the 17th century usually wore armor. These armors were pistol-proof. They were not against the bullet of the matchlock musket, they were against the bullet of the pistol. So when we see the old regulations, they all say that you have to go as close to the enemy as possible to see the white of their eyes. And they all say that your distance is good when the flashes from the muzzle can reach the face of the enemy. So this is not more than 2-3 meters. That's the tactical distance for these pistols. And this is why they don't have the sights, because they were intended to be used as a close combat weapon. Also, there is a difference how the pistol was handled. If you see a gangster movie today, you see that the people are using the pistol like this. Well, and this was the case in the 17th century as well. So if you check the old manuals, you will see that the pistol was not intended to be aimed like this, but it had to be bent a few degrees, probably 90 degrees, to the left side to help the powder in the pen settle just where the touch hole is. This just made the ignition more secure. And of course, if you ran out of cartridges and you did not have time to load the pistol, it was still capable of being used as a club, hitting each other on the head, which was, let's say, the last line of defense. If we go to a black powder shooting match today, we see that people are usually wrapping their bullets into the patch, saturated with some kind of lubrication. Well, this patch, or Pflaster in German, it's not really supported with any historical source from the 17th century. But anyway, as people are using it, I will try it now, but this part of this project is not a historically accurate shooting project.
Using a patch surely results the tightest fit and the best seal, but no sources mention the use of such extra. In fact, handling the pistol on horseback just does not allow to use this method, as the bullet is too hard to ram down. In the heat of the battle, the soldier had to be able to load the pistol quickly and conveniently. The tight seal resulted in a high muzzle velocity and 750 joules of muzzle energy. Now there's the energy range of the 357 Magnum. Regardless of the tight fit, the accuracy did not improve, proving that the limit here is not the windage of the bore and bullet, but rather the lack of front and rear sights.
Tactics by those times were quite difficult for the cavalryman because the pistol was primarily the firearm of the cavalryman. Well, to understand how they fought, first we have to understand what kind of cavalrymen were existing in the beginning of the 17th century. The first cavalrymen to be equipped with a pair of pistols were the German reiters. These reiters, they had a special tactic called the caracol. It comes from the Spanish word snail, which just describes the form of movement that they were making on the battlefield.
Using caracol tactics was an unlucky try to fight the Spanish tercios. These were large bodies of closed infantry fighting formations consisting of 2,000–3,000 armed men with 4–5 meter pikes, muskets and arquebuses. This strong defense was just like an unbreakable fort for the cavalry. Breaking through was impossible, so the riders rode close to the front of the enemy infantry, fired their pistols and returned to save distance to reload. The traditional cavalry charge disappeared for a while.
Well, this was not really an effective way to fight from horse, so the military thinkers of the 16th and 17th, beginning of the 17th century, they were all thinking about how to make reforms and how to utilize the advantages of the cavalry. And this was the point where the Renaissance came inside. Renaissance really meant the reinvention of the old Roman and Greek values. And this was the case with the military as well. So all the military thinkers were trying to reach back to the Roman times and understand why the Roman legions were so strong and so disciplined and so organized that they could occupy the known world. What sources they had? First of all, they had Vegetius, the military institutions of the Romans, a beautiful regulation that describes how the strong and effective legion should look like. Second, they had the Tactics of Aelian, a beautiful book written by a Greek guy living in Rome about the military structure of the Roman Empire. And there was the Tactics of Leo the Wise, the Byzantine emperor. These were rediscovered by Justus Lipsius, a Flemish philosopher, and later this was put into practice and formed to be the Dutch system by Maurice of Orange or Maurice of Nassau. Maurice's system was based on the old Roman fighting formations and tactics, and I have to say that they were quite successful when using the pike and the musket together. This, the firearm and the cold weapon, it was merged together in one unit, in one closed formation unit squares on the battlefield, and they were supporting each other. The case of the cavalry was much harder. At the Battle of Pavia in 1525, the foot soldiers armed with muskets were able to stop the charge of the heavy knights, the old medieval heavy knights, only with the volleys of fire, which meant that a poor guy, a foot soldier with nothing in the pockets, could kill a noble man from a distance. So the military thinkers started to evaluate what kind of use the cavalry will have on the battlefield. It was obvious that firearms had to find a place in the tactics of the cavalry as well. But how to do it? That was a great question. Because whenever you're playing with your firearm, it means that you are taking away very, very important value from the cavalry, which is the surprise and the dynamism. We have millions of instructions for the foot soldiers, but we have very, very few for the cavalrymen. Also shows that it was a much difficult task to understand the place of the cavalry on the battlefield. Well, we have four very good sources on the other hand. The first one is Lodovico Melzo. It's an Italian guy, a cavalryman, wrote a regulation for the heavy cavalry and for the light cavalry. The second one is Johann Jacobi von Wallhausen, a very well-known writer for military instructions, cited a million times. The third one is Basta, Giorgio Basta, of Albanian origin, but living in Italy, very experienced cavalry officer. And the fourth one I would like to mention is John Crusoe. He was probably not a soldier. Oh no, I'm pretty sure that he was not a soldier, but he was the one who just synthesized the first three and then wrote a general instruction for the parliamentary forces. All of them technically used the same kind of system to differentiate between the different horse soldiers. Before proceeding to the various cavalry units types, let's check what kind of firearms they use. Well, I have to say they used all kinds of firearms. First of all, they had pistols. A good horse soldier was expected to have at least a pair of pistols, same caliber, same type. There were many occasions when more was requested from them. We know when the horse soldier had to go to battle with 3, 4, 5 pistols, especially when they were using the caracol system. This was essential to have as many pistols as possible. But the most common was a pair of pistols, or if the soldier did not have the money, then one or nothing. Second, there were soldiers armed with a pair of pistols and a carbine. They were the bandeliers, or the arquebusiers, mounted arquebusiers. The carbine, the wheel of carbine, is originated from the arquebuse. The arquebuse, or the caliver, was a shorter, lighter firearm than the musket, which was more suitable for cavalry use. Originally it had a matchlock ignition system, but later it was converted, it was changed to wheel-lock system, which is much more convenient for the cavalry, as I already told you. The effective firing range of the carbines was around 30-40 meters. This was a distance where it was capable of piercing the armor of the enemy, but not more. Usually these carbines were smoothbore, and the caliber was between 12mm to 18mm, so it was considered a middle caliber. And also there were cavalry types which used muskets, and they were the dragons or dragoons. They received the same maximum 5 kilogram muskets with a caliber of 18 to 20mm. They had the same kind of apostles, so they could fight on horseback and they could fight as an infantry as well.
Rectangular slugs could be made two ways. First, with casting a lead bar and cutting it to pieces with an axe or knife, as Luigi Fernando Marci described it in his work about the Ottoman Empire. The second is hammering a musket ball to the required shape. Here I am replicating the exact copies of such 30-gram slugs found at the location of the siege of Zrínyi Újvár in 1664. The closer we move to the southeastern borders of Europe, the more time we encounter these projectiles, proving that logistics had strong challenges in this region.
Hammering a musket ball into a rectangular shaped slug to fit into the smaller caliber bore of wheel-lock pistol or carbine was nothing but a sign of hard times. It was only used when the proper size bullets were not available for the pistol or for the carbine. But let's see now how accurate the pistol is with this kind of slug.
The hammer slug was the easiest to load. First, it is larger, so it is easier to handle. Second, if the size is good, it goes down the bore without ramming. However, a pistol loaded like this cannot be holstered anymore, as without welding the bullet will fall out. The gap between the bore and the rectangular slug is large, and the fit is loose, so large portion of the gases just blow out useless. Recoil is heavy, and of course the bullet is inaccurate. Highly inaccurate. These bullets are highly unstable, they are keyholing, so it is time to check how this thingy flies with the help of a high-speed camera. Take a closer look to see how this rock and rolls in the air. On the other hand, let's not forget that the wheel-lock pistol was not intended to be shot at 25 meters.
So let's see now how actually these horse soldiers were fighting and how they were organized. The cavalry units of the early 17th century were divided into light and to heavy contingents. Although heavy seems to be the most important, they were not. The light one was the most important one, so I'm going to start with the light cavalry units first. Let's talk about the bandoliers. The bandoliers were armed with a carbine, a pair of pistols and a sword, but their primary weapon was the carbine.
These soldiers were only fighting with the arquebuses and carbines from horseback. They had breast and back plates, helmet and a bandolier holding the gun with powder flask, priming box, bullet and cartridge pouch and spanning key hanging on it. According to Wallhausen, they were organized into 64-man companies. Their basic fighting formation was the 8-file, 8-rank square, but the ranks could be doubled of course to have a wider front if necessary. They were usually the first in attacking the enemy and used the countermarch system to fire by ranks and to keep up the continuous volleys. The effective range of the carbine was not more than 30-40 meters.
The second cavalry unit, that's principal arm was a long firearm as well, was the dragoon or dragon. The dragons were united into 200-man units.
A dragoon company had 100 mounted pikemen and 100 mounted musketeers. Their musket was the same light musket as the infantry had, and they were using the same apostols for charging as well. They were often armed with the breastplates, but in the middle of the 17th century the armor was disappearing from their equipment. They were drilled like the infantry, but could also fight on horseback. Their basic fighting formation was the 10-rank deep square, with 100 pikemen in the middle and 50-50 musketeers on the flanks.
So they really did everything the same as the infantry. Their horses were usually the lowest quality possible, because when they dismounted from the horses, they were kept back a few hundred meters behind the battle formation, the fighting formations, and usually if they were attacked and routed, then all the horses were lost. So that was such a high cost that they decided usually to give the worst possible and the cheapest possible horses to the dragoons. And now comes the heavy cavalry. A new type of cavalry soldier was the cuirassier, armed with 2 pistols, a heavy sword and full metal armor.
The cuirassier was basically a lancier without the lance. Lanciers were expensive and needed too much training, and they were not really effective anymore in the 16th century, so the cuirassiers were taking over this role. Their main arm was a pair of pistols. They charged by ranks using the countermarch system, and only when they ran out of cartridges they changed to the sword. Their basic tactical formation was the 10-rank 10-file square, with 100 men in the company. They rode close to the enemy, fired the pistols from point-blank range, and then returned to safe distance to reload again if it was necessary. If not, then the charge could be continued with the sword, but the pistol was the principal weapon. The fourth cavalry unit I would like to talk about are the lanciers. They were the last remains of the noble knights of the Middle Ages. Their primary weapon was the lance, but they were also armed with the pistol pair, and also they had a sword. Lanciers were also wearing pistol-proof armors and were unified in much smaller units as the other horsemen. According to Wallhausen, a company of 40, 50, 60 lanciers had the same power as 300, 400 knights in the Middle Ages. They were charging in the second wave, but not in one body, but by ranks. After hitting the enemy, the rank had to wheel to the flanks to return to the back of the formation. Only when the lance was broken or lost, they started to fight with the pistols. By the way, Wallhausen also separated the horse soldiers according to their role on the battlefield. He said that the arquebusiers and the dragoons are attacking soldiers, so they are offensive soldiers. The lancier, that can be a defensive and an offensive soldier as well, but the cuirassiers are defensive soldiers. Besides the over-regulated Western cavalry, a new type of light cavalry evolved in Eastern Europe. The Croats and the Hungarian and Polish hussars had more flexible, versatile tactics, and their equipment also differed a lot from the previously mentioned horse soldiers. We have excellent sources for replicating the musketry drill of the infantry, but we are in much deeper problem if we are looking for something for the cavalry. But we are lucky because we have John Crusoe, who wrote down the complete loading process of the wheellock and flintlock pistol, and he also shared us the loading process of the carbine. And he also gave us some information about how to make proper cartridges, because paper cartridges were already in use in the 17th century, and by the way, in the 16th century as well. The wheellock pistol, the paper cartridge and the firearms armed cavalry was born together. The number of cartridges taken to the battle was never really more than 10 pieces. They could be carried in pouches or cartouches attached to the holster, flask, bandolier or scabbard. Usually all soldiers had 2 powder flasks, one for the main charge when loading with loose powder and one for the finer grade priming powder. The basis of the training was the drill, a strict regulation on handling firearms and for all movements. This was required for 2 reasons. First, to create a well-trained soldier who can participate in the volleys and will not leave its place in the ranks. Second, it is related to the old Roman values of military disciplines, because without discipline, no battle can be won. John Crusoe described the pistol drill in 17 steps and added another 4 movements to cover the snap-hands flintlock pistols as well. When we are talking about the accuracy and killing power of historical firearms, we have to be sure that we are firing the proper charge and the proper bullet from the bores. In the 17th century, most of the military firearms were smoothbore and they were loaded with an undersized ball, so there was a windage between the bullet and the bore. This was important because the contemporary powders left many falling in the bore, so the pistol and the rifle had to be loaded easily, conveniently and fast. If you check the ramrod of a historical firearm, you will see that it's a very thin thing. It's a very light, very thin ramrod, which means that it was not intended to hammer down the bullet. That means that the windage had to be large enough so the bullet can be loaded into the bore even if the barrel was full.
When we are excavating a bullet from a 17th century battlefield, it is not always easy to determine what kind of firearm it was fired from. The problem comes from the naming of the calibers, various calibers. First of all, there are two calibers for a bore. Well, there is the bore caliber and there's a bullet caliber, the roll caliber, as it was called in the 17th century. One determines the size of the bore, the second determines the size of the bullet to be loaded into the bore, easily rolling into the bore without ramming it down. The problem is that in many of the contemporary documents, we do not know which caliber they use. So that's one problem. The second problem is that the bullet size was not given in millimeters or inches or whatever. It was given as a measurement against 1 pound of lead. So which means from 1 pound of lead, how many bullets can I make from the exact diameter? The problem comes from the fact that there was no unified measurement for the pound. So the English pound was different from the pound in Augsburg or Zuhl, and also the Wiener pound, it could be different. So that technically meant that each and every single firearm, even if it was named a 24 bore pistol, it still could have different calibers. The third problem comes from the lack of military standards. There were no centrally issued gauges that were used for manufacturing the pistols or checking the parts of the pistols, which meant that all manufacturers used their measurement to determine what is a 20 bore or 24 bore pistol. Also, we have some problems with the manufacturing qualities, the manufacturing accuracies. So we cannot say that they could measure with 1/10 of a millimeter, even when making a bore or when making the bullet mold. So we have millions of question marks regarding the bullets. And the same goes for the powder. First of all, we don't know if the powder that they used was already grained or it was just a mix of the ingredients. Both were in use in the early 17th century. Second, even if we know the mixing ratios, because we have beautiful sources for the mixing ratios, we still do not know exactly what kind of process was done with during the manufacturing of the powder. The power of the powder also depends on the quality of the fineness, the cleanness of the ingredients. So there are a lot of question marks here that we cannot answer. So what chances we have if you'd like to find the proper load for a 17th century, historically accurate proper load for a 17th century firearm? Well, I have to say not much. We will never ever be able to replicate it because we just do not know the quality of those powder and the weight of the charge. The information we have, however, can help us as a guideline. First of all, usually the weight of the powder charge was given as a ratio of the weight of the bullet. This could be 50% or 33%. So a half charge or a 1/3 charge. I usually use the 1/3 charge because the modern powders are much stronger than the 17th century powders. We can be sure of that. Second, I always choose the largest grain size powder available for shooting handheld firearms. Understanding the killing power of a historical firearm fascinates me, so I'm going to use some ballistic gelatin to test the capabilities of the wheel-lock pistol and its, let's say, close to historical loads. First, I'm going to fire the standard paper cartridge into the gelatin from not more than 3 meters. And then I'm going to fire the hammered slug into the same gelatin block. Let's see what happens.
My goal with these experiments was not to determine if the bullet can pierce the armor plate or not. I have quite good reasons for not testing this, as the quality of the armor plate raises a million questions. My basic intention was to compare the performance of the bullets of the wheel-lock pistol to my previous ballistic gelatin experiments. To be as authentic as possible, I decided to fire the pistol from a point-blank range, just as it was intended to be used in the 17th century. The bullet penetrated deep into the block, leaving a beautiful mark in the gelatin. The entrance wound itself was nearly as large as the ball, and the waves of good energy transfer were clearly visible. The block captured the bullet and it had only minor deformations. The sprue was a bit melted and pressed into the ball. The ball impacted with nearly 700 joules of muzzle energy and transferred all its kinetic energy to the target, resulting in a strong central cavity and an impressive damage to the surrounding tissue. The wound channel was contaminated all way long with residues of black powder and paper particles.
Interesting, isn't it? Well, now it's time to move on to the hammered slug.
The velocity of the hammered slug was less than half of the round ball, but its weight was more than double, so still delivered an impressive 360 joules of kinetic energy. The first slug impacted with the side and transferred all the energy to the block in a very short distance. As the block has two sides, I had one more chance to catch a bullet impacting with the point as well. And I was lucky. The second bullet hit the block just as I wished for. The side impact left a dreadful entrance wound that was longer than the bullet itself. It was also interesting to see that the front of the block was decorated with unburnt and burnt powder and paper particles. The second impact had a much smaller entrance wound, same size as the round ball, but penetrated much deeper in the gelatin. It is interesting to examine the two fire slugs on the right. Their edges are grinded by the bore of the pistol. They also lost some 7 to 8% of their original weight due to this grinding effect.
Now let's compare all this to the effect of the 9mm parabellum round.
The imprint of the 9x19 bullet is the second from the top, the longest penetration. The 8-gram bullet was fired with 325 meters per sec and delivered 422 joules of kinetic energy. The effect of the round ball, visible on the top, and the 9mm round is nearly the same, but the energy transfer of the wheel-lock bullet is much better due to its softer metal, larger diameter and ballistically inadequate form. The effects of the slugs, visible at the bottom, were completely different. These slow-moving large bodies lacked the shock effect of the faster and lighter bullets, but had a much stronger energy transfer with cutting a horrible central temporary cavity. But whatever the visible differences are in this picture, we can be sure that all were capable of instantly killing a human. The wheel-lock pistol played an important part in developing the firearm tactics of the cavalry, but could not help this old noble arm to be competitive against the modern infantry. The use of pistol was overrated, and in the second half of the 17th century the mounted soldiers reverted back to the sword and pike again as a principal arm, but pistols remained the standard secondary arm of the cavalry soldier once and for all.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching the Capandball YouTube channel. I really hope that you enjoyed this little time travel. And if you can and if you wish, you can support me on Patreon. You can find the link under this video. And of course, please do not forget to hit the subscribe button if you like what I do. So until next time, stay cool and keep your powder dry.